Imagine for a minute it is 1980 and you have just entered and just got accepted to a university to take some classes. As you walk onto campus, you have to go and register for your classes, so you have to actually physically show up, and then you have to go to the registrar's office and fill out a form. After you fill out this form, you realize that 3 of the classes you signed up for are already filled, and so now you have to go back and pick some different classes. Well, understanding the process that it takes to get information into a certain system and pull it back out is kind of the topic of this. Because if you can imagine what it's like, what it was like just 30 years ago, before we had all this great information system and technology to facilitate the business processes, we wouldn't be where we are today. So today where I want to start, so the questions. And question 1 starts from the case at the very beginning of the chapter. So in the case study, there's a discussion about how best to deal with this vendor that this company, GearUp, the imaginary company, this vendor, how best to deal with a vendor that doesn't always follow through with their promises. So they may say, we have 1,000 of this product to sell, and they make a guarantee, yes, we will give you 1,000 of this product to sell when you complete your auction. But when the auction's complete, they only deliver 800. How do you deal with that? So there's got to be business processes built in for dealing with these types of issues. So we're going to start with trying to understand what exactly is the business process. And then we're going to step back and say, all right, what is a business process in general? So we see one specific example, then we look at the big picture, more abstract, or what are business processes in general? Question 3 gets into how can information systems improve these processes? So all businesses have processes, so how things are done. The question is, can we make them better? And then we step back even one more step and a little bit more abstract and say, all right, what exactly is information? So we're talking about information systems, but what exactly is this information that we're talking about? And what are these characteristics about information that makes it high quality? So it's actually quite a bit we're going to dig into here. Let's start with why does the GearUp team need to understand business processes? So, well, first off, what we found was there might be a problem with their process and they don't know yet. Maybe it's with their vendor selection, maybe it's just with a particular vendor, maybe it's how they deal with the vendor when there's issues. We don't exactly know if this is a ongoing problem or if it's a temporary problem. We don't know if this is a issue with the process itself or with just with the vendor. So there's a lot of unknowns right now. And in order to get there, first you have to understand, okay, what exactly is the process that's going on here? And then that can help us identify the problems. Now, you might say that, oh, and then in this case, we see that one of the vendors canceled at the last minute. And it's creating a lot of havoc going on in the organization. So is there a way that we can change the process so there isn't this kind of havoc if the vendor changes their promise? So do we need to redesign the current process? And do we need to know where and how to save on costs, especially in this case because GearUp's goal is to be the low-cost leader. And so just because they have one vendor who frequently offers the lowest price, just because they offer a low price doesn't mean that the entire process of dealing with them is low cost. So you have internal costs that may be higher because of the vendor costs of doing business, if that makes sense. So you got to look at procurement and sales processes and how they show which information can help GearUp to record problems and better negotiate or avoid its problematic vendors. So what exactly is this? What is business processes? All right. And as we talk about this, I'll refer back to the GearUp process. Okay. So a business process is a network of activities for accomplishing a business function. All right. So it's a set of activities that are connected together, and it has one specific function that the business is trying to accomplish. Now, this could be something like buying and managing inventory. It might be making sales to a customer. It may be how you pay your bills. It may be how you collect revenue, and hundreds of other business functions. And oftentimes, some of these micro business functions can be consolidated into a bigger business function. So some of these interrelate with one another. So let's take a look at GearUp ordering activities. Okay, and this is kind of breaking down exactly what they're talking about in their case study here. So GearUp starts with a buyer negotiating the quantity and price for items. So they do this in order to create an auction where they're going to sell off these things from their vendor. So the idea behind this is that GearUp is selling things before they actually have the products in hand. They're negotiating with their vendor to say, all right, we're going to sell soccer balls this time, and we're going to create an auction, and we're going to sell the soccer balls, but we don't actually have those in our warehouse. We're going to sell them first by finding out how many people want them at this certain price. So they create this auction. Visitors come to the website, they bid and say, yes, I want it at this price. When the sale ends, that's when GearUp is going to send a notice back to their vendor and say, hey, we need this many soccer balls because this is how many people have ordered it. And so then their vendor, in this case General Sports, will send all of these soccer balls to GearUp, and GearUp will basically repackage them. So they get them in a big, maybe in a big box, and they'll take it, and GearUp will repackage it into small containers that they can then ship out to the customers who have successfully completed the auction and bid on it. So they take it from bulk, repackage it for individual shipments to customers, and then the customers receive their orders and pay their bill. So vendors agree to sell. So here's the key points. Vendors agree to sell certain quantity of items to GearUp at a very low price. GearUp negotiates price and number of items, then conducts an auction on GearUp's website. After the auction closes, GearUp orders the total number of items sold, and then GearUp receives the items in bulk from the vendor, repackages them, and ships to a customer. Right. Now, this is not a process that's completely unknown. I mean, there are companies, and here's an example, Zulily.com, that actually does this very thing. And so I go out and take a look at their website so you can get an idea. You have to actually register as a member in order to see one of the auctions. But once you become a member, then you can bid on these items within their auctions that they have daily. They have daily auctions of all kinds of products, and it's in that way they follow through with this process, right? So it's not unheard of to do this. So we can take those words that we just used on the previous slide and make it a very precise document or model that shows this process. And so this is the modeling part. We talked earlier in the semester about learning how to model. This is it, man. So this is taking everything that we just said and identified all the specific activities, all the specific actors, all the specific sub-processes and data repositories and where information is moving. So that's where all these little arrows come from. And even the sequence of what happens in what order. So it includes a whole lot of information right here in this one model. And so the BPMN stands for the Business Process Modeling. Shoot, you think I'd remember the end. The Business Process Modeling Notation. There we go. The Business Process Modeling Notation helps to capture all these important start points. Now you'll notice up at the top by the buyer, there's a circle with an arrow pointing. That's the start of the process. And so in this case, there's a specific person at GearUp who's called a buyer, and there might be more than one buyer, but there's a buyer who selects a vendor and a product, and they send off so the vendor has some sort of marketing materials of that's what the stuff they're selling, and so the buyer looks at that their catalog, and oftentimes this is they say, all right, I see what you have for sale. Let's negotiate on a price for these products and what quantity you can maximally supply at this time. Now, oftentimes there's also vendor data repository, so there's some database with the list of vendors and the things they've bought in the past, and that helps with the buyer and their selection. Okay. Now, there's a negotiation that goes on, so a back and forth in negotiating the price, but once a price is selected and the quantity selected, the buyer then sends that information to the event sales office. And so there are maybe one or more people in the event sales that create a specific auction for these products. So they set up and run the auction. Now there might be some sub-function or some sub-processes within this. How do you set up the auction? Regardless, once the auction is set up, it runs. We have customers who then, when they go to the website, will see the auction and will put bids in to buy a product. Once the auction ends, the total number of items to purchase is sent to operations. The operations people are the ones who order from the vendor. So they have this list of items, they send it back to the vendor, and that's that orange line that runs from the order goods from vendor to ship goods. So at the vendor, they receive the order, they turn around, they ship all those goods back to the operations, and the operations receive the goods. Once they receive the goods, then they can repackage it and ship to the customers. Now you'll see here that there's actually 3 different data repositories. There's the vendor data repository, there's the customer order repository, and there's a vendor order repository. Part of the problem that was occurring at GearUp was that these 3 pieces of data were separate. And so the buyers wasn't seeing what was going on in operations. And that was a major problem, or at least it's suspected to be a problem. They haven't looked at and done a comparison yet to really see if it is. But this can make a big difference in who they order from, because if there's certain vendors that consistently cause a problem at the operations side, that information will be important for the buyers to know so that they can then create better negotiations, or perhaps avoiding certain vendors altogether, or favoring good vendors more often. So again, here's the business process symbols. We have a start and an end of the business process. We have various activities and various sub-processes. And a sub-process means that there's a lot of stuff that goes on inside of that. So that could create a new model that you can then create, right? There's data repositories, And then there's the data flow, which means some information has to flow from one activity to the next. And then there's also the sequence flow of steps. So this step happens before this activity happens before this activity. Now, the components in a business process. Now, we obviously talked about the activities, and those are the ones that transform resources and information of one type into another. We also have a lot of roles that are being played here, and those are what some people what you might refer to as the swim lanes, or the columns on that model you just saw. So we had the vendors is one role. You have a buyer is another role. You have event as an event setup is another role. You have the operations as another role, and then the customer. Okay, so not even all these roles are internal to the business. Many of these roles are actually, or two of those 5 roles are actually external actors. You also have various resources that are being used. Now this includes people, facilities, and even computer programs that work within this business process. And then you also have a repository, which is your collection of business records. So question 3, how can information systems improve the process? Well, there's 2 basic ways you can judge the quality of any process, which is through its effectiveness or its efficiency. So efficiency is usually more quantifiable in that you can say we've decreased our costs, or we've saved some time, or we need less infrastructure. So this might be that you've improved the process so that you can sell off one of your warehouses. Might be an example of that. So that's efficiency, and it's usually, because it's very quantifiable, it's very easy to point to it and say this has been improved. What's a little bit harder to accurately judge is the effectiveness, but probably far more important. So this is looking at, does the business process enable the organization to accomplish its strategy? In other words, its long-term goals and objectives. And so that is something, it is a powerful judgment of quality. It isn't, and then and so let me make sure I make this very clear. Effectiveness is this accomplishing what we want to accomplish? And so sometimes, and I've seen this happen before, like when I'm teaching web development class, and some of my students will evaluate an external website and oftentimes make recommendations. And one common recommendation they like to throw out there is, you need a social media platform, you need a Facebook page. But sometimes they make that recommendation without looking at the effectiveness of creating a social media page. So just because you recommend it doesn't mean it may not help them achieve their business goals. Social media certainly is something that a lot of businesses are doing, but the question isn't, are a lot of people doing it? The question is, does it really help you achieve your long-term goals? And sometimes it can't do that. Or it might just be wasted time. Right? Now, GearUp's current process, as we have already shown, is not very effective. And GearUp wants to provide the lowest possible prices. Now, a couple people think that its operational costs are too high. Drew believes if buyers knew about the problems caused by certain vendors, buyers could negotiate compensation for the cost of the problems or avoid these vendors entirely. In order for that to happen, they need a new business process. So that's what we're going to look at next. What can they do to change? What can they do to change this process to make it more effective? So here's one potential that they could do. they could try to combine the vendor information with that is being captured both by the buyers and the operations. And so now if you look at the data, when they select a vendor and product, they're going to look at the vendor order repository that's being housed in operations, so they can see the history that's applied to each and every individual vendor when the goods are purchased, or I'm sorry, when the goods are received, how many are received, and what were the issues that they had along the way. So there's now one single share of an integrated repository of vendor data. So by this one simple change though, this gives the buyers far more knowledge by looking at the specific data, the specific history of their interactions with a vendor. So buyers are far more empowered to make a better judgment about who gets what vendor to work with, what is a good negotiated price, and so on. Hopefully now you can see where simple changes in information systems, though, can have an impact on the business itself. So suppose you're in supply chain management, or suppose you're in marketing. These little changes with how the information system works can be a very powerful technique for improving how your job gets done. And if you can understand where data is being stored, how data is being stored, how to pull that data out to make meaningful information, now you have something that you can use to do your job better, right? All right, so how can we use information systems to improve the process quality? Well, there are actors and instructions on both the human side and technology side, all sharing data. And one very common technique is the automation. Automation can automatically move work from the human side to the computer side and back. So in this case, we're looking at various different actors that can go into your business process. And you can have people and hardware that are actors. So what are some hardware that are actors? Well, you might have like an RFID chip, which stands for radio frequency identification. And if you don't know what that is, that's fine. You can do a quick Google search and find that out. You might have a webcam as an actor. You might have a server that's an actor. You might have a laptop or tablet that's an actor. But then, both for the hardware and the people, there's a set of instructions on what to do. These can be both the procedures that people do, or the software, which is basically just a program set of instructions for the hardware. And these instructions basically are telling the actors how to interact with that centerpiece, the data. And so what we have here is we have actors who are doing activities in the business, right? They have certain instructions or roles or processes that they need to do. Those are identified either through software or through procedures. Now sometimes you can take those procedures and program them into software. Not all the time, but many times you can. But all in all, the main point here is we want to focus on the data. The data is the bridge between the human side and the computer side. So if that's what data is, what is information? Where does information fit into this picture? And so that's the next question. Well, and you can look around and you'll probably find different definitions of what information is versus what is data versus what is knowledge. Here's how I like to liken it. Data might be a specific piece of information. So if you look down below, you'll see a 67-73. You look at that, you're like, well, that doesn't mean anything to me. It's just a couple numbers. Is that a subtraction problem? Is that a comparison? What is that? Or maybe that's the score in a basketball game. It was 67-73 at the end of the game. Without having the full context that data is basically meaningless. So you can record data and lots and lots and lots of data, but unless there's a context built around it, it's completely meaningless. So where is information? Well, information is putting data within a context. So when I take that number and say, well, 67-73 is actually going to be the temperature range for today on May 22nd, 2014 in the city of Greenville, North Carolina. Okay, it's not really. It's actually supposed to get 90 today. But you get the point, right? So now you have some meaningful information from that data. But sometimes that requires you to put together different pieces of data. But the important thing is you create a context. And the only people that can create that context are people. Right? Computers can't do that. Software, hardware, they can't do that. The data itself is just numbers. So we're still a very integral part in this process. And from this information, we can create knowledge. So this is information that we can pass on to other people and make decisions, solve problems, manage projects, collaborate with one another to make powerful business processes that can solve or help leverage our business objectives to create a very powerful business. And that's how it all ties together. Okay, so we want to get data, and here's another important thing to consider, that process data or data processed by summing, ordering, averaging, grouping, comparing, or other similar operations only gets you halfway there. You need to put it within a context. Also consider that you can sometimes even display data like as in a graph, but a graph is not in itself information. Graph is still data that you and others perceive, use to conceive information. So here's a graph of Amazon stock price, right? And I grabbed this morning, and it shows this current stock price of Amazon at 305.70. What does that mean? 305.70. Well, without putting it within a specific context, it doesn't mean anything, right? So is that number a big number? Well, yeah, 305 is kind of big, but so does that mean you should buy Amazon? Does that mean you should sell? Does that mean the price is going up or down? Well, you have to kind of look at the history. You have to look at all the other bits and pieces of information to see what exactly it means. So it's our ability to perceive information and to tie it together in terms of concepts and take those concepts and apply them in a value added manner that gives us value to these pieces of data. So the most important part of any information system is actually you. The quality of your thinking, your ability to conceive information about data, determined in part by your cognitive skills. And how do you develop those cognitive skills? By learning more information. So in order to be able to think, you need to have knowledge. And in order to have knowledge, you need to look at more pieces of data, apply it to think, to create abstract concepts, to understand processes, to see the relationship between different activities. So I'm trying to show you that information systems can greatly facilitate this process, but it can't replace the process. Right? So information is value you add to an information system. Who adds the value? You add the value. And so yes, we can go about automating a lot of things with information systems. But, and here's an important part of that but, automation can certainly save a business some costs, but unless it's creating value, it is just worthless. And the only way it can create value is if there's people at the end of it that are adding value. And we're going to come back in the next chapter and talk a lot more about how a business can create value. Um, one thing about the way the book describes it is I think they miss some of the big picture, which I'm going to hopefully tie that back into so you can see how that all relates to each other. But information is value you add to information systems. All right. Lastly, what data characteristics are necessary for quality information? All right, number one, it needs to be accurate. Now this sounds like a very duh type of answer, right? Well, of course you're going to want accuracy. However, that's not always easy in practice. So for example, you might let's take the example of a vendor, right? You're working with a vendor and you enter in all the vendor information. Now, you remember the original process that GearUp had. It had two different data sources, and the vendor, there was two databases that had vendor information in it. What's the problem with that? Well, because what happens if the vendor decides to change the name of the company? Or maybe they change their primary contact. Somebody at the vendor got promoted or changed jobs, whatever. You could have it correct in one database and not in the other. That happens more often than you might imagine. Or sometimes, and this can happen especially with global organizations, some businesses will have different names in different countries, or will have slight variations of their name in different countries. So there might be Google Europe. There might be in here in the United States it's Google, but over in Europe it's called Google Europe. Well, how do you input that into your database? Is it two different vendors? Is it Google and Google Europe? Or is it one vendor with an alternate name? And maybe there's different contact information for each one. So how do you put that into your database? So being accurate is not always as straightforward as a lot of people like to pretend it is. And a lot of times when inaccuracies do develop, it can be a problem. And that leads to the next one. Is it timely? Is the information in there something that you can use right now? Produced in time for its intended use. So a lot of times, yeah, you can have a database with all the information out it, but it may take a long time to get the information out. So suppose you need to make a decision today, but in order to run the report to get the information will take an entire week before you receive it. Well, that's not timely, is it? And so then the information is not of high quality if you get it a week late. It also needs to be relevant to the specific context and subject that you're currently making a decision on or trying to solve a problem on. You also want to avoid providing too much information, because it is really easy for us to get overwhelmed by information overload. Most of you, if you look at a lot of databases, the data in the databases as they currently exist today in a lot of organizations, you go start looking through that database and you'll be instantly overwhelmed by all the information in there, all the data in there. Let me rephrase that, all the data in there. And so you cannot see, you cannot make any sense out of all of it. So what you would prefer to have is just barely enough information that specifically addresses your concern. So just barely sufficient amount of data to create the quality information you need. And then lastly, you need to ask, is it worth its cost? So the relationship between cost and value, and we'll come back to this again. We're going to hammer on this point of value. Information systems cost money to develop, maintain, and to use. So it must be worth the cost to do this stuff. Yes, you could buy a mainframe computer, but is it necessary? Yes, you could record every single time somebody drops a pencil, or maybe And we have the capabilities to do this today. Maybe we can put up cameras that are constantly monitoring what's going on and recording every single second. You could put hundreds, thousands of cameras all over your business and record everything that goes on. And you can have databases that can store all this video. But is it worth it? Just because you can do it doesn't mean it's worth it, right? And so that's, again, the last piece of that puzzle there, right? Okay. So today what we talked about, and hopefully we built up this set of questions, was why does GearUp team need to understand the business process? And part of it is they need to understand that to figure out what's working or where the problem actually is. And so by doing that, they can then better solve the problem. So what is the business process? What is the business process? Well, it is a set of functions, activities that are being done, and the flow of data between actors, and an entire set of activities from going from a specific to achieve some specific business goal, right? And I showed you a good way of modeling this information. Information systems can help improve these processes to give you better quality through better efficiency and effectiveness. So that way you can hopefully go into your organizations as you leave here and say, all right, first I need to learn the business process. And so before you can make any recommendations for improvement, you need to know what is the current business processes. And then if you understand how information systems work, then you can start making suggestions for improving that process. Because let's face it, yes, some of the time you're going to be actively doing those processes. You're going to actually be the action, doing the activities themselves. But the real power and the real success of businesses is the improvement of their business processes. And information systems help tremendously with that. How? By looking at the relationship between data and information. And knowing that in order for people to use the hardware and software effectively, they need that core piece, that data, to bring in important, let me rephrase that, not important, but to bring in the context for data to create meaningful information so they can make better decisions, solve better problems, and to manage their projects better. So the understanding that relationship between data and information will hopefully allow you to make better decisions. And so what are the characteristics of quality information? Well, we broke those apart as well, right? They need to be timely. They need to be accurate. They need to be relevant. They need to be just barely sufficient, so not too much. And it has to be worth the cost. Well, that's it for today, guys. In chapter 3, we're going to dig into a little bit more organizational strategy and how information systems fit within that, particularly how you can take information systems to create a competitive advantage. So we're going to take the ideas that we've learned here in the business process and apply that to the actual organizational strategy to see how a competitive advantage can be created through information systems. And there's a lot of potential here. And so hopefully not all of this will go over your head, because it is wickedly awesome what you can sometimes do with this stuff. It doesn't always work, and again that gets back to the whole experimental aspect of what I hope you get out of this class. But many times it can be very effective. All right, that's it for today. Take care, guys, and I'll talk to you soon.